The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book, and in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 62 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Can you believe it? We only have 2 more days of 2015, and today marks 1 full year of broadcasting. Can I say broadcasting about a podcast? I'm not sure. Anyway, let's say podcasting weekly. So it marks 1 full year of bringing you this show each and every Tuesday. Of course, we didn't just bring you 1 episode per week. In some weeks, we issued more than 1 episode. So all told, we have explored history together through 56 episodes in 2015. All I can say to that is, wow. And thank you for listening. In fact, if you have listened to all the episodes of this podcast in 2015, I salute you and give you permission to have a cookie, because that means you have spent about 50 hours exploring history this year, and that, my friends, is hardcore. Of course, we haven't yet explored history in 56 different episodes in 2015, because this episode, episode 62, marks the 56th episode of 2015, and it's a great episode. The Bill of Rights stands as one of the United States' founding documents. Judges, politicians, advocacy groups all use the Bill of Rights and its language to support, defend, and advocate for their positions on free speech, freedom of religion, gun control, legal searches and seizures, and the right to jury trials. But did you know that when originally proposed by James Madison, the Bill of Rights constituted not 10, but 36 amendments, and that the House of Representatives didn't even want to discuss these amendments? Today, we explore the Bill of Rights and its ratification with Carol Birkin, author of The Bill of Rights, The Fight to Secure America's Liberties. During our conversation, Carol reveals why the House of Representatives seemed reluctant to debate and pass the Bill of Rights, how James Madison's 36 proposed amendments to the Constitution became 12 amendments, and the ratification process those amendments underwent in the states between 1789 and 1791. But before we dive into the Bill of Rights, I have some big plans and exciting guests for Ben Franklin's World in 2016. If you would like to be among the first to know about these plans and guests, you should sign up for the Franklin Gazette newsletter and join the listener community on Facebook. And you can do both of these actions by texting BF World to 33444 or by clicking the orange Join Now button on the benfranklinsworld.com homepage. And you can't miss this button. Not only is it bright orange, but it's the button right below Ben Franklin's Join or Die snake image. Okay. Are you ready to discover the Bill of Rights and the debates concerning its ratification? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, Here is this week's special guest.
Joining us today, we have the Presidential Professor Emerita of American Colonial and Revolutionary History at Baruch College, which is part of the City University of New York. She has published numerous articles and consulted on documentaries for the History Channel and PBS. She is also the author of 5 books, including The Bill of Rights, The Fight to Secure America's Liberties. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Carol Birkin.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to it.
Carol, the Bill of Rights represents one of the many books that has come out lately about the United States' critical period. But rather than writing about the Constitutional Convention, your newest book, The Bill of Rights, explores the origins of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution and the fight to get them ratified. Alec would like to know why you chose to write about the Bill of Rights and how your new work adds to our understanding about the document.
Well, I had already written a book about the Constitutional Convention, and it seemed sort of logical to me, this is my period, this is my field, to take a look at what happened next. I'm a linear thinker, I guess. I had always thought, as I think most people always thought, that everyone in Congress really couldn't wait to pass the Bill of Rights. And it only took a little while reading the congressional debates to realize that this was not the case. And so that really whetted my appetite to write a political history of the Bill of Rights. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not a lawyer. I wasn't interested in writing about how the Bill of Rights was interpreted in major court cases 150 years later. I was really interested in what happened in 1789 and what the debate was about and why it was so hard for Madison to get the House of Representatives to even talk about these amendments, about this Bill of Rights. And I discovered this amazing story of political acuity and political stupidity and perseverance and aggravation. And it was really a fascinating experience for me.
I'm glad that the idea that Congress seemed hesitant to discuss the Bill of Rights fascinated you, because that's what fascinated me about your book. We just take the Bill of Rights for granted that everybody wanted it passed, and it really just didn't seem that way at all.
No. And also what's really interesting is Madison's motivation. He was an extremely savvy politician, and he realized more quickly than most of the Federalists that they had made a terrible tactical error by not passing one at the Constitutional Convention, because it gave the opponents of the Constitution an emotional appeal to people who were a little wary of the creation of a strong central government, a strong national government. Oh, look, they're going to be tyrannical. Oh, look, this is a blueprint for monarchy. You can't trust a powerful central government. And proof positive is that there's no Bill of Rights attached to the Constitution. Madison and everyone else knew that since the federal government had been given no powers to deal with civil rights, what we'll call civil rights, that it was ridiculous to have to pass one, but politically it was a terrible mistake. And so Madison's goal, in effect, his political goal, in effect, when he stood up in May and said, I want to propose 30-something, 36 or 39 amendments to the Constitution that would be a Bill of Rights, he did it in order to, in modern parlance, separate the leaders of the opposition from their base. Let's give them a Bill of Rights, and then the remaining anti-federalists, or really states' rights advocates, won't have any emotional appeal. There won't be any scare tactic they can use. And this is why he did it, and it took really well over a month for the light bulb to go off over the heads of the other Federalists in the House of Representatives and realize fundamentally what a smart move this would be on their part. So it's like watching politics in action, to read those debates and to read the newspaper articles and to read the letters that these men are writing about whether this is a waste of time, whether it's a good idea, whether Madison is nuts, whether the Anti-Federalists can be defeated. It's really politics at its best.
In episode 61, we spoke with Ed Larson about the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and the need for a constitutional convention. Would you tell us about the two sides that erupt after the Constitutional Convention that are talking about whether or not we should ratify the Constitution, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists?
Right. First of all, let me just say that I do not pose the question of the Articles as weak. This isn't a who can lift more weights in the gym. The Articles of Confederation really absolutely met all the goals of the Revolution, to create a very restricted central government. That's what everybody wanted, really, when they went to war. They wanted state sovereignty, independent state sovereignty. And it doesn't work. It produces enormous problems for the survival of America, at least in the minds of the Federalists, in my mind as well, but there's some debate about this among historians. But at least men like Washington, Hamilton, Madison, John Jay, they thought the country was in danger of really disappearing. The men who opposed them really were carrying forward, ironically, the ethos of the American Revolution, which was that only local government, only a government that the voters could see and watch over, act as watchdogs over, only those governments made up of men who earned their living the same way you did, even if they made more money, who knew your needs. Only those people should have powers like the power to tax, the power to regulate commerce. So they're carrying forward no taxation without representation. The Federalists are really proposing the creation of a nation. They're proposing something really different, and their vision is quite different from the vision of the men they label the Anti-Federalists, the poor Anti-Federalists. The Federalists jump in first and call themselves Federalists when they're really nationalists. The Anti-Federalists are really Federalists. They want a confederation. And it's tough to be called anti-something. But they are men who honestly, ideologically believe that state governments are less likely to lead to tyranny than a strong national government. The Federalists, on the other hand, believe that that's all well and nice, but you're not going to have a country. And the Federalists believe firmly that they have built in so many checks and balances, so many safety clauses that the government can't possibly become tyrannical. So both sets of men are pessimistic about human nature, both of them. They all think that eventually republics are going to devolve into tyrannies. They all think that people can be corrupted. But the men who wrote the Constitution believe that they're stalling it for quite a while by this intricate pattern of checks and balances. The Anti-Federalists say, absolutely not. The president's going to be a tyrant or the Senate is going to be a tyrant. These people are going to oppress us. They're not going to know what the farmers in Georgia need. They're not going to care. And so there is a kind of pervasive sense on the part of the Anti-Federalists that this government denies what they had fought the revolution for. At the same time, it's also true that they are largely leaders in their state governments, and they're smart enough to realize that if there is a national government, if it has the power to tax, if it has the power to regulate commerce, their power will be diminished. So, as with most politics in any era, there's a kind of personal consideration joined to an ideological one. I'm not saying the hypocrites are that they're justifying their own self-interest. I'm saying that those two operate simultaneously in the Anti-Federalists.
Are there hotbeds of anti-federalism in New York and Virginia? It just seems that when we talk about the ratification of the Constitution, it was a contentious issue in many states, but especially in New York and Virginia.
Yes, although, of course, Rhode Island refused to even participate. That was a hotbed of opposition as well. And, of course, they called it Rogues Island because it had democratic tendencies, and the men who wrote the Constitution and the men who opposed the Constitution were far from believers in democracy. In Virginia, I think that the personality and the leadership of Patrick Henry, who voices, if you want to hear the anti-federalist ideology in oratory, you read everything that Patrick Henry said at the ratifying convention in Virginia. George Mason opposed. These are big leaders and powerful political figures in Virginia. And Virginia is a very powerful, wealthy, populous state, so that these men feel that a national government is going to diminish the importance and the power and the control that Virginia is able to exercise because it is such an important state. And so the cluster of anti-federalists in Virginia is a powerhouse, and they continue to be the strongest critics of and the opponents of the government even once it is in place. And you can connect the dots to Jefferson's Republican Party, which forms not only based on not wanting the government to have so much power, but on the fear that Hamilton's programs that he puts into place in Washington's first administration favor commerce and oppose agriculture, which is the heart of Virginia. In New York, it's a quite different situation, although it also has a political component of men, who the men are. George Clinton, who is governor of New York, has really organized his own political party in New York. He deals out patronage. He's very savvy. He's even got a strong base in the commercial center of New York, which speaks to his political prowess. And New York is very well situated to remain, in terms of its commerce, in control of its own commerce, because the port of New York City is where most imported goods come in for New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. And New York is simply doing those two neighboring states in by charging enormous sums of money for these imported goods. I mean, money is just pouring into New York. And George Clinton does not want to see this diminished. If a federal government takes over control of commerce and sets tariffs and sets duties, New York will suffer. Connecticut and New Jersey can't wait for this to happen. It's one of the reasons why they ratified the Constitution almost immediately. They are rumored to have been meeting secretly as the Constitutional Convention is about to begin to plan an attack on New York. I mean, that's how serious it is. And George Clinton manages to make sure that the three delegates to the Constitutional Convention, one is Alexander Hamilton. He can't get around that. He represents commercial interests par excellence. But the other two are henchmen of Governor Clinton, and they get up in July and say this convention is treason, and they depart. So they're dyed-in-the-wool, what we will call later anti-federalists. So these sources of political power in these two states, matched with the economic strength of these two states, makes them the two most intense struggles over the Constitution.
It does seem that when New Yorkers and people in Virginia realize that their states are going to go the way of ratification, that they begin to call for something called a second constitutional convention. Could you tell us about those calls and what they hope to achieve?
This is the ghost that haunts the dreams of men like Madison, who at the time is an ardent nationalist. After Hamilton puts forward his programs, he becomes a states' rightist, of course, because he's from Virginia and under the thrall of Jefferson. But the big nightmare hanging over the nationalists, the really intense nation builders like Madison, is that they're going to try to call for another constitutional convention. And there's no question in anyone's mind that the first thing they're going to do is proposed to take away the federal government's power to tax, take away its power to regulate commerce, and take away its power to create a uniform currency. The three pillars of the creation of what 18th century people called an energetic government. And no one thinks that that is not what they would try to do. Being now more savvy, the Constitution was written in secret. A lot of people didn't even know what it was about, so the Anti-Federalists don't have time to mull over, to think about what their strategies will be. Unlike the Federalists, John Jay, Hamilton, and Madison can write the Federalist Papers, which are fundamentally talking points for the convention. If someone raises an objection, you leaf through to Federalist number 51, and there's your reply you're supposed to give. The Anti-Federalists don't have this, but by the time the Constitution is ratified, they do. And so the fear is they will be able to mobilize enough support for a second constitutional convention to basically return to the Articles of Confederation. And this is why Madison says we simply must crush this movement. It is a danger.
Is crushing this movement why Madison decides he wants to take up the issue of amending the Constitution in the first Congresses?
The strongest motive Madison had, political motive. He had promised the voters in the counties that elected him to Congress, which, by the way, were gerrymandered in such a way by Patrick Henry that he was up against a lot of anti-federalist sentiment. And so he promised that he would propose a Bill of Rights. And so this was a campaign promise. But I think his real motivation, as I said, was that he wanted to steal the thunder of the anti-federalists. And if a Federalist Congress was elected, which it was, the Federalists took the House, they took the Senate, they took the presidency, so they controlled the government. He said, if we pass a Bill of Rights, if Federalists get credit for this, then the people will be less fearful that we're planning a monarchy or a tyranny. They'll give us a chance. The government will have a chance, and the Anti-Federalists won't have any emotional issues to appeal to. But Madison is a very complex man and a very interesting man. And as he began to think more deeply about this issue, he came up with what I think, though it sounds corny, a kind of moral reason for passing a Bill of Rights. Everybody was concerned about tyranny. Everybody. There was a potential tyrant under every bed, and Madison agreed. But where Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry thought the tyranny was going to come from the federal government, Madison said the tyranny is going to come from the American majority, who will be able to oppress minorities. He's not talking about African Americans. He's not talking about women. He's talking about, in most cases, members of Protestant sects like the Baptists, who were a small minority in those days, or the Moravians, or people who had different views from the majority of citizens. And he said, we have got to protect these people from the tyranny of the majority, because that is the most terrible tyranny of all. And he said, even though this Bill of Rights has no power to be enforced, if we can pass it and make it part of the political culture of our country, if we can, in effect, he doesn't have this word, but this is what he means, get members of the majority to internalize the value that minority rights need to be respected as much as majority rights, that everyone has the rights we're listing in these amendments. If we can get people to internalize this, it will act as an internal brake on the tyranny of the majority. They'll stop. They'll say, this is un-American of us to do this. This is not what this country stands for. And that was Madison's greatest hope. And of course, what's interesting is if you ask people today, they will say exactly what Madison dreamed of and hoped for. They will say, well, the Bill of Rights represents our values, it represents our ideals, it's what we stand for. And that was exactly what Madison hoped for. And I think it really drove him to persist even more than his political motivations.
When Madison sets his mind to something, watch out. In the Bill of Rights, Carroll describes how Madison proposed 36 constitutional amendments for the consideration of the First Congress. Carroll, what kind of amendments was he proposing? And 36? That just seems like a lot. I mean, the document's 10 amendments.
Madison was not a great stylist. If he turned in a paper in your classroom today, you would red pencil it all over the place. He was very wordy. He was verbose. He went on and on and on. And thank goodness the House appointed a committee called the Committee of 11 to consider Madison's proposals. And they took them and they said, not that they really said, oy vey, but they took them and they said, oh my God. And they created declarative sentences and they made full use of the semicolon and they condensed what Madison had written in so many words and so many separate proposals. They condensed them into 12 proposals. The semicolon is critical for Article 1. Here are all the things. Madison had broken every one of those liberties and rights down into separate amendments. And so they transformed his very verbose rendition into a more easily comprehensible and easier to deal with set of amendments. If his had gone up to this, and actually the Senate red penciled them again. That is, the Senate even tightened the language of these 12 amendments stylistically. And so what Madison produced on the whole retains what he wanted, with the exception of one clause that he very much wanted. His greatest defeat was that he wanted to give the federal government the power to enforce the Bill of Rights, that they could go into the states if the states were doing anything that infringed on the liberties or rights of the people of the state. He wanted the federal government to have enforcement power, which of course it does not get until the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. And he takes this as a very crushing defeat. But other than that, almost everything that he wanted shows up in these 12 amendments.
Could you give us a refresher? Briefly, what are the 12 amendments that Congress ends up debating?
Well, I'm not sure I can do it by heart off the top of my head. The first two don't pass. That is, the first two are amendments that have to do with the right of the Congress to vote itself a raise. And a lot of the states said, that's outrageous. And the second, these were the first two amendments, and they fail. These two, which moves everything up to the 10 amendments. The second amendment has to do with the proportion based on population of representatives in the House of Representatives, and the states don't accept that amendment. The First Amendment is the one that most people think about. That is, what your rights and liberties are. You have the right to free speech, you have a right to assemble, you have a right to your religion, practice your religion. These are all, when most people, ordinary citizens, you ask them about the Bill of Rights, they talk about guns and they talk about all these freedoms that they have. And that's in the First Amendment. That's right there. Interestingly, I think, and I try to make this point in the book, interestingly, a lot of these rights are a history lesson on their life as colonies. That is, they reflect problems or what they consider to be oppressions that the British government imposed upon them. So do a lot of the legal, the rest of the amendments after the amendment about the militia. The bulk of the next, say, 4 through 8, are amendments about, in a sense, the common law. There are amendments about trial by jury, cruel and unusual punishment, even eminent domain. They're concerned with property rights and judicial rights. There's a hysterical conversation. I know most people don't think that reading the congressional debates could be funny, but actually it can be. They're talking about cruel and unusual punishment, and a representative from New England who hasn't said a word through the whole thing gets up and he says, I don't know about saying no cruel and unusual punishment. Some men just need to be whipped. So even about things that we think it's a no-brainer, there were people who had their own concerns about these amendments. The last amendment is the most hard-fought amendment by the anti-federalists in the government. They want the word expressly put into, it reads something like, any powers not granted to the federal government belong to the states or to the people. And they want the word expressly put into that amendment. And this is a case where a single word would really have changed the course of American history. Because what they're saying is, if it is not literally mentioned in the Constitution, you can't do it, which would mean that the necessary and proper clause, that implied powers, would be completely impossible given that amendment. And as a result, you would not have had the Bank of the United States. You would not have had the purchase of Louisiana. I mean, untold impact by adding this word. And happily, the Federalists dominated the Congress, and it was not included. I think that the anti-federalists took this, or the anti-administration men took this as their most crushing defeat. So the amendments are a combination of process rights, that is, what happens if you're tried, do you have to testify against yourself, and some amendments that seem irrelevant to us today, really, except as historical artifacts. The government doesn't have a right to house troops in individual people's homes, which was a big issue when the British Army came to Boston before the independence was declared. But I don't think anybody today is running around worried that a battalion of the Marines is going to be housed in their apartment. But those amendments are about process, legal process. The First Amendment is about the rights of the people. And the Second Amendment, despite what the NRA says, honestly, the Second Amendment is about the rights of the states to defend themselves against a potentially tyrannical federal government.
You raised an interesting point about viewing the Bill of Rights as a history lesson, and you can see that clearly in the Declaration of Independence as well. They outline all their grievances and they talk about the history of those grievances. Can we also view the Constitution as a history lesson?
Well, this is the way I like to pose it when I used to give a talk about A Brilliant Solution, which was my book about the Constitution. A lot of Americans think, it's American exceptionalism run rampant. They believe that the Constitution invented checks and balances, that the Constitution invented separation of powers, or inspired by God or Moses or someone, that all of these things were brand new. Nothing could be further from the truth. After the Puritan Revolution in England, you have checks and balances. The king is checked. The right to declare war and to raise taxes goes to the House of Commons. You have a separation of powers in English government, in the colonial governments. The colonial government has an executive council, which is like the Senate, and a House of Representatives, the legislature. They have an independent judiciary. Everything that's in the Constitution, with one exception, everything in the Constitution reflects an Anglo-American political culture that is centuries old. They are borrowing from what they experienced, what they helped direct as members of colonial legislatures and as governors, and from proud English tradition that they respect. The only innovation in the Constitution is, in fact, federalism. That is, some powers belong to the federal government, some powers belong to the state governments, and some powers are shared between the two. This had never been heard of. When the American colonists proposed to Parliament that there be an American Parliament and there be an English Parliament, and both of them, they would be autonomous, but they would be loyal to the king, people fell out of their chairs laughing. You can't divide sovereignty, they said. That's impossible. That's the stupidest idea we ever heard. And now they do it in the Constitution. And for a very simple reason, in 1787, the states had all the power. I mean, that's where power lay, and the federal government is trying to siphon a good bit of that power away, and so they can't take it all. So they say, well, we'll share a lot of it. You can tax, we can tax. You can have an army, that is the Second Amendment, the militia. That's what that amendment is about. You can have an army, we'll have an army. When Hamilton heard this plan, he stood up in the convention and he said, this is never going to work. The only solution is to abolish the states. And everybody said, basically, sit down, Alex, take your medicine. I mean, this was ludicrous to them. But, of course, Hamilton pretty much was right, because we have the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, we have the nullification controversy, we have the Hartford Convention, we have the Civil War, we have Orville Faubus standing at the schoolhouse door saying, I don't care what the Supreme Court says, Arkansas is not going to do that, and on into modern-day conflicts over everything from abortion to marijuana. It has been one of the biggest problems in American history. It's never been really resolved how you divide power like that. If you read the Constitution and try to think about where these ideas came from, basically you're going back into the history of England and going back into the history of the colonies.
What is the title of your book on the Constitution?
It's called A Brilliant Solution, Inventing the American Constitution. And actually, ironically, the brilliant solution I meant was that they allowed an amendment process. I'm an anti-originalist of the first order. I think it's absurd to say, what would James Madison do about nuclear warfare? And they didn't think that the Constitution was written in stone. I mean, they knew that the world would change, and they knew that Americans 3 generations later needed to have the right to adjust their government to their circumstances. So I really meant the amendment process, the right to amend the Constitution, but it wasn't clear. A lot of people accused me of excessive patriotism because I called the Constitution a brilliant solution. So to all you graduate students out there, be careful what you entitle your books.
Earlier, we discussed the process of ratification of the Constitution and the debates over it, the Federalist debate and the Anti-Federalist debate. And we've talked about how the House of Representatives and the Senate shortened and tightened Madison's amendments down to 12. What was the debate or process of ratification like in the states?
Well, the state legislatures have the power to ratify amendments. And there were debates. I mean, there were certainly the states' rights people were offended by the fact that none of the amendments limited the power of the federal government, which was, of course, Madison's triumph that they didn't. And so the Virginia state legislature dealt with it tardily. But on the whole, it went through pretty easily. They went through pretty easily. And they went through pretty easily in part because most people realized in the state legislatures that there was no enforcement power, that the Bill of Rights, they called it a parchment barrier, a paper barrier, and others called it throwing a tub to the whale, which comes out of a Jonathan Swift story where whalers distract an angry sea mammal by throwing a tub in the water, and in theory, the whale chases the tub. So a distraction, a sleight of hand. And so, interestingly, once it passed, That is, once the amendments passed, the 10 passed, everybody just forgot about them immediately. They were just completely ignored. When Jefferson, as Secretary of State, announces that the Bill of Rights have been ratified, in his report, it comes after a statement about fishing rights and fishing licenses. And they just cease to have, except briefly in the Alien and Sedition Act arguments. But after that, they just disappear because there's nothing the federal government can do until, as I said, after the Civil War. And even then, the only concern was really voting rights for black men and re-enslavement of blacks. The Bill of Rights doesn't become significant in our legal system until the 1930s. I mean, I found that to be really quite extraordinary. It's not until the 1930s that the courts begin to incorporate what the Bill of Rights says into their decisions. If you ask anybody in the grocery store today, they will insist that from the minute the Bill of Rights was written, they were the credo of America. And in fact, they're not even ratified by Georgia, Connecticut, or Massachusetts until 1939. Georgia and Connecticut are so angry that they don't include a diminution of the government's rights, that they won't ratify them. And Massachusetts ratifies them and then never remembers to send the federal government their official notification. So it's not till 1939 that the Bill of Rights is endorsed by the 13 original states.
How cool would it have been to be the historian that finds Massachusetts misfiled paperwork?
Right, right. I mean, it's so, as I said, there are a lot of funny moments in reading about this. They debated and they have 4 or 5 committees and they're bogged down in bureaucracy, and then finally they pass it and then nobody remembers to send it on. I would love to have been the person who realized this, who located the fact that there's no record of fortunately for me, another historian had done that work.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Carol, in your opinion, what might have happened if the states had heeded the Anti-Federalists' call for a second constitutional convention? What would have happened to the Constitution of 1787, and how would the government of the United States be different today?
Well, the federal government under the Constitution would be made impotent, and I doubt seriously that there would be a United States. I'm hoping that where I live right now, New York, would be taken over by the French because they have the best cuisine. But I share the Federalist view that either the states were going to go to war with one another over trade, which, Virginia and Maryland had gunboats aimed at each other to prevent smuggling, or European powers far more powerful than the then struggling little United States would have moved in and bitten off pieces of the United States virtually at will. So I think I have a dire answer to that, and that is that there probably would not have been the United States.
And would you tell us about what aspect of history you're researching and writing about now?
I'm now writing a book for Basic Books called The Republic in Peril, 4 Crises of Sovereignty in the 1790s. I wanted to call it Sex and Puberty, but I thought that would sell better, but it has a real history title. And it's an effort to reinterpret or look at the 1790s, not through the prism of the rise of the Republican and Federalist Party struggles, but through the prism of the difficulty of establishing the sovereignty of the federal government to its own citizens and to foreign powers. I'm going to look at the XYZ affair, the Genet affair, the Whiskey Rebellion, and talk a little bit about how precarious it was to get American citizens to believe that a law passed by the federal government was a real law, shades of many things today, and to get countries like France not to think that America was just a satellite that could be used to advance their own agendas. And so that book, and then I think I'm done. I think I'm hanging up my computer and I'm going to play with my grandchildren.
Well, it sounds like a fascinating project. Is there a place on the internet where we can go and look up more information about you and your progress on this work?
Well, probably not progress on this work, but I'm pretty sure if you Google me, and I'm pretty sure that you'll find all the books that I've written and scores of TV shows, documentaries I've been in, and lots of podcasts that I did for various organizations. You'll get too much information, I think, be bombarded with me. And I think Baruch probably has, my college probably has I know the history department has a website that I'm probably still on. And Amazon has pretty much all of my books dating back to first generations women in colonial America. So, or people can, if they're interested, they can email me. And I'd be glad to answer any questions I have the answer for.
Carol Berkin, thank you so much for taking the time to explore the Bill of Rights with us.
Thank you for inviting me to do so. I enjoyed it.
Can you believe that the House of Representatives did not want to debate the Bill of Rights? Today, we view these first 10 amendments as one of our founding documents, and yet when the first Congress debated them and the states ratified them, most people didn't think they were a big deal. That's the part of Carol's book, The Bill of Rights, I found so shocking. And I don't know about you, but I would have loved to have been the historian or state employee who found the ratification paperwork that Massachusetts forgot to file. I'm not really sure what I would have done if I had found that paperwork, but I'm pretty sure part of what I would have done would have involved picking my jaw up off the ground. On a more serious note, today's episode marks an addition to several episodes we've had throughout 2015 that explore the United States' founding documents. In episode 18, Danielle Allen helped us investigate the context and the text of the Declaration of Independence. In episode 38, Carolyn Harris revealed the role Magna Carta played in the United States' Constitution. And in episode 61, Ed Larson helped us look at the Constitutional Convention from George Washington's point of view. Now, don't worry if you can't remember all of these different episodes. I will include links to all of them on the blog post page for this episode, where you'll also be able to find more details about Carol and her book, The Bill of Rights. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/062. If you love Ben Franklin's World and would like to help support its movement to restore history and historical thinking to the forefront of the public mind, text Support BF World to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com/movement to discover what you can do to help support this podcast and its efforts. Do you have the Ben Franklin's World app yet? It's a free app that not only ensures you never miss an episode, but if you can believe it, it also makes listening to this show easy and even more enjoyable. If you would like to download this app, visit benfranklinsworld.com/apps and click on the iOS or Android link so that you can download the app that's appropriate for your smartphone or tablet device. You can also find the app by searching for Ben Franklin or Ben Franklin's World in the Google Play or iTunes App Store. Finally, this marks the end of our 2015 season. What has been your favorite episode? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode or in our listener community on Facebook. Happy New Year, my friends. I look forward to exploring more early American history with you in 2016.
And remember, Never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.